Since the beginning of known history, the human family has been growing. For the past 250 years, this growth has increased exponentially, and during the great worldwide baby boom, world population grew even faster. Since the publication of Paul Ehrlich's 1968 book, The Population Bomb, many of us assumed that populations would always grow, and that this population growth would be all bad. But what most of us didn't realize is that while populations were growing, fertility rates were actually declining. And today, over 90 countries and territories have sub-replacement fertility rates, which means that unless something dramatically changes, the entire world population will begin to decline in the lifetime of today's young people. And the economic consequences of this can only be described as a demographic winter. For most of the world's history, human populations have grown, albeit at a slow, constant rate of growth.
And then just in the last 500 years, and in particular in the last 200 years, we've had this great takeoff in human population.
Benjamin Franklin was the first to identify this takeoff in population growth. In 1751, he proclaimed that populations double in size every 20 years. By the late 1700s, demographers began to use mathematical equations to explain this population takeoff.
The population of an individual country, of a community, or of the world would grow. If it was unchecked, it would grow geometrically, doubling and doubling again.
This doubling and doubling again became known as an exponential population growth law. This law predicted that populations grow like money does when earning compound interest over time, getting always bigger and bigger. And then something happened to reinforce this population thinking.
As we moved into suburbia and got this stable life after World War II in the 1950s and happy days, people just felt good about the future and they had kids.
Sociologists aren't quite sure why the baby boom happened. But because of it, population growth increased, at least compared to previous decades.
And it was growing very fast. Population of the world has doubled within my lifetime.
Beginning in 1946, annual births exceeded 2% of the total population. During an 18-year period of time, this growth resulted in 77 million babies born in the United States, and some 450 million babies were born worldwide. In 1951, writer Sylvia Porter called it the biggest, boomiest boom ever known in history. And somehow, from that description, the name baby boom stuck. And so did our thinking that population growth would continue at an ever-expanding pace. And furthermore, in 1968, something happened to make a lot of us start believing that all of this growth wasn't all good.
Paul Ehrlich, for instance, wrote one of the best sellers in the field called The Population Bomb.
Dave Brower from the Sierra Club and Ian Ballantyne, who invented the pocketbook, came to me and said, why don't you write down your ideas and we'll publish them as a mass market pocketbook and maybe we'll get something done. And so Ann and I wrote the book Population Bomb in about 3 weeks, and I became known as the Population Bomber, even though the title I wanted to have was Population, Resources, Environment, because it had a lot of emphasis on resources and environment in addition to population. So that's where the population bomb came from. Its goal was to insert the population issue into the environmental discussion. And from that point of view, it was certainly a success.
This book convinced many of us that overpopulation was all but inevitable, and that environmental degradation and mass starvations would result.
The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now.
Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, became a Bible, particularly for young college students, and there's a dramatic change there.
A dramatic change resulting from this book was the lasting cultural assumption that population growth was necessarily bad for the environment. But the book may have also affected our perceptions of families as well.
The ethical issues around the population problem really mean that people have to think much harder about their ethical responsibilities. For example, people say, but I want to have 5 children. Well, the issue isn't just what you want to have. It also is what kind of world are your children going to live in? What does your having 5 children do to the chances of somebody else even having 1? What does that mean for your grandchildren? What does that mean for your great-grandchildren? In other words, you can just as well say, well, I have to have $5 million, so I'm going to go rob the bank. Well, ethically, having 5 children is about in the same league as going and robbing a bank, because you're denying other people and your descendants resources which, in some sense, I think they have a right to have.
In summary, human populations have always grown. But in the last 250 years, they have grown so much more quickly. During the baby boom, the rate of that growth increased, and consequently, by the late 1960s, many of us began to believe that human populations would always grow, and that this growth was necessarily bad. But what if, while we were worried about population growth, seeds of population decline were quietly taking root? Three definitions will help us as we begin to understand population growth. First, a population is the total of people living in a region. Second, a birth rate is the number of births per 1,000 people born in a population during a year. And third, a fertility rate, sometimes simply called fertility, is similar to a birth rate. It is the average number of children born over the lifetime of the average woman in a given population.
Fertility has been falling in the U.S. and the world for a long time. The first demographic transition, we call it, started with the Industrial Revolution.
Birth rates have declined while populations have increased. But how could this be?
The reason the world has experienced a population explosion is not because human beings suddenly started breeding like rabbits. It's because they finally stopped dying like flies. The world's life expectancy has more than doubled over the past century. What's really driven up human numbers has been a health explosion. It's been a health explosion that has driven the population explosion, 100%.
Post-World War II vaccines and antibiotics accounted for most of the change in population growth rates. Back in the 1960s and 70s, most of us had no idea that the baby boom, at its peak, was a mere 3.7 children per woman in the United States, not 8 or 9 or 10 children per woman, as some believed. And by the early 1970s, fertility rates had already taken a dramatic turn.
Starting particularly in the 1970s, many people in the world got extremely alarmed by how fast world population was growing. So people looked at those trends and they said, how are we ever going to feed all these people? Won't it have a terrible effect on the environment? And as it turned out, another thing was going on at the same time that people were obsessing about, this so-called population bomb, which was that around the world people were having smaller and smaller families, fewer and fewer children.
And at that time, fertility rates came down very low, and they have continued to fall since then.
As early as 1971, the United States fertility rate dropped to below 2.13 children per woman. 2.13 children per woman is an important number because it is what demographers call the replacement fertility rate. With fertility above 2.13 children per woman, populations grow in the long run, and with fertility below this rate, populations will eventually decline. By the mid-1970s in the United States, the total fertility of some 80% of women, though white demographic, had fallen to a sub-replacement rate of 1.8 and has never moved much since then. By 2009, and only because of immigration, total U.S. fertility was at 2.05, which is sometimes optimistically referred to as at replacement.
I think it reflects the fact that we have so many Hispanic couples now who are citizens of the United States, and they tend to be married before they have children, and they tend to have more children.
It's the one group in American society, Hispanics and Hispanic immigrants, that are having children fairly early, having 2 or 3, and everybody else in American society has either lower fertility on average. Fewer people are having children. Maybe the people who have children have 2, but it's only 3/4 or half of all women.
What we're seeing in terms of demographic trends around the world, I think, is very troubling. Of all the developed nations, there's only one, the United States of America, that currently has a replacement rate birth rate. The rest of the developed countries are all below replacement, in some cases staggeringly below replacement. Spain, of course, couples averaging 1.1 children. Italy in about the same situation.
You know, there's been a great decline in maybe 70 countries now that are below replacement fertility.
Fertility rate is very low. It's 1.38 in Europe, whereas the rate needed for survival is 2.1.
And this is also swept across East Asia, so that Korea and Japan also are at 1.2 children per woman, way below replacement levels.
The most dramatic global trend with respect to fertility has been this remarkable march towards sub-replacement fertility on a global basis over the past generation and a half. At this point in time, it looks as if half, or maybe slightly more than half the people in the world, live in countries whose fertility patterns imply sub-replacement if they would be continued over the longer term. So sub-replacement fertility is now the norm for the world as a whole.
In fact, despite population growth of the last 50 years, worldwide fertility has actually fallen by 50%. So although just 40 years ago we thought that populations were always going to grow, sub-replacement fertility rates mean that unless something changes, population decline will become more and more common. How long does it take for a population with sub-replacement fertility to begin to decline?
When the childbearing patterns of the society go down to a level which is not sufficient to sustain population growth over the long term, population doesn't immediately decline. It takes about a generation, or sometimes a little bit more than a generation, for the population of such a country or society to peak. But after that lag, it will surely peak and then decline indefinitely if there isn't compensating immigration or if the childbearing patterns don't change.
Japan is an example of what can happen over time to populations with sub-replacement fertility.
Japan was the only major developed country in the world not to have a baby boom after World War II. World War II was a devastating defeat for them. They were in Reconstruction. They had a baby boom coming into World War II, and a very short one just after when the soldiers came home. After that, their births went down.
Japan had an average fertility rate of something closer to 1.2 children per woman, rather than the 2.13 children per woman needed to maintain its population over time. Thus, while Japan had a birth rate of approximately half of what's needed to simply maintain its population size, more of its people were living longer. And so, until 2005, when more of these elderly began to pass away, Japan could claim a growing population. So, though largely unnoticed, Japan's sub-replacement fertility meant that the land of the rising sun had actually long been setting. Thus, it took Japan about 60 years from the end of World War II to begin to depopulate. Other countries with sub-replacement fertility will take more or less time depending upon their unique demographic factors.
Demographics, as you probably know, is the science of population. And everything that goes on in society, everything that goes on in politics, everything that goes on in culture, in economics, affects obviously the demographics. And the demographics are basically life, death, and migration.
Populations with a fertility rate over 2.13 resemble a pyramid over time, but populations with a fertility rate below 2.13 resemble an upside-down pyramid over time. As a population transitions from above to below replacement rate fertility, a population structure is gradually inverted, as can be seen by graphing Japan's population change over time. Once a population structure has become inverted, there are more deaths than births, and a population is said to be in depopulation. And despite what we may have previously thought, for the same reasons that populations can grow exponentially, populations can also depopulate exponentially. Consider that with a replacement rate of 1, 16 people are replaced by 1 in just 4 generations. 1 million people are replaced by only 1 person in 20 generations. Clearly, when there are more deaths than births, entire regions of the globe can change dramatically.
There are places in the world today where deaths now exceed births. In a lot of Eastern Europe, there are more deaths than births on a regular basis. In Russia today, there are at least 140 deaths for every 100 births. There are an increasing number of countries in the world that might be referred to as net mortality societies. And in the years ahead, not so far in the future, Western Europe is poised to become a net mortality society, a net mortality region.
One Eastern European country that already has more deaths than births is Latvia.
From 1989, for example, to 2002, the population has decreased by 13%.
Many are surprised that even the United States, with its near replacement fertility rate, would shortly be in decline were it not for immigrants and their children since 1970. Still, population dynamics can be so tricky that even major news organizations regularly get it wrong. The United States sub-replacement rate includes immigration, and according to the United Nations, is projected to decline in coming decades. But regardless of eventual population realities, the only news headlines we tend to see are those that reinforce our population growth paradigms. Consider this UN press release dated March 2009. While best estimates do show that populations will reach 9 billion by 2050, It is also true that a mere 15 years later, world population growth will probably peak.
The world population, while still growing, is growing ever more slowly every year and is on a course, if we just project current trends out, to actually be declining in the lifetime of today's young people.
In fact, by one UN estimate, worldwide population decline begins in 2040.
The way demographic trends are going now, reductions in birth rates and aging of populations, world population will peak around 2065, give or take maybe 5 years.
The really big news headline is the one that few of us have yet to see. For the first time in world history, total world population is projected to decline. So isn't this all good?
Well, you know, many of us have been so worried about population growth or population explosion worldwide for so long. It's hard to shift gears and worry about a lack of babies being born.
If experts are having a hard time adapting to the new realities, the possible consequences of depopulation have scarcely registered for most of us.
So for Russia, it is one child is enough for the majority of the families.
I think 2 or 3 is the best.
I think 1 or 2.
I believe 2 is a good figure.
I would have loved a third one. I would have loved a third one.
1, 2. Well, as long as we have enough money to bring them up.
Tu peux en adopter au Liban.
Yeah, I know. My son said we could adopt.
One in Lebanon.
If we were younger when we had the children, maybe I would have considered, but I think 2 is a good figure.
Ideally, more than 1. Personally, I come from a large family where children were considered a gift of God. And of course, now you have small families because they feel they cannot afford more than having 1 or 2 children. And of course, in those days, you didn't know contraception, so people took the children that were on their way.
I have 1 sibling. I've got 1 older sister, and I think that was ideal. So I would probably say two children would be the best.
My daughter was an only child, and I saw how different it is to be, you know, from a large family and to have siblings, younger ones, older ones.
Again, I'm an only child, and I've always believed that a smaller family, especially because I come from a third world country, so I see how a smaller number of children is better for, so much for limited resources and opportunities that the child will have.
Well, from our day-to-day experiences, it's very easy to gather the impression that the world is growing ever more crowded and that population growth is a big problem. I mean, after all, most of us, as we go about our day, are constantly having this experience of somebody standing in line in front of us, somebody who, if he weren't or she weren't there, our day would be a little faster. Also, traffic grows worse most places every year, so it's very easy to gather the impression just from the surface of life that we're living in a world that's ever more crowded, right? So that's how we get into this trap of thinking that population growth is in itself an evil. It's not. Any species that, for whatever reason, is not reproducing itself has something wrong with it. Charles Darwin would be the first to say that any species that has abundant food, peace, prosperity, and yet fails to have the children needed to replace itself is become maladapted to its environment.
Maladapted or not, the world is projected to depopulate. And even if we may generally assume that population decline will be all good, we might also want to consider whether or not unexpected consequences will result from it. And as it turns out, our modern economies require growing levels of something called human capital.
Well, human capital refers to the knowledge, skills, information that people have. Modern economies are based on information and knowledge, not physical strength, but mental command of different types of information and skills. So it's the foundation of modern economies. Any economy that doesn't have substantial investments in its people's human capital won't be able to become a modern or a rich economy.
Human capital is that capital, that capacity that the child acquires to be competent out in the marketplace. The more they've learned, the more valuable they are. You know, with each degree you get, each rise in education, your lifetime earnings go up quite significantly.
Human capital is a term economists use to describe basic human resources, things which allow human beings to be productive.
Why is productivity important for economies?
Growth in an economy is based on productivity advance, which is the engine, fundamentally the engine of growth in any economy.
If human capital growth is essential for modern economic growth, how is human capital impacted by fertility decline?
Well, it's hard to sustain economic growth without human capital increases. And so you can increase human capital either by getting everybody way, way educated and improving each person's productive capacity, or you can have more people. There's really only two ways to do it.
The way we measure economic progress is through what we call the gross domestic product. Now, many people don't realize that when the gross domestic product grows, most of that growth is population growth. Economists define gross domestic product as the number of people, workers specifically, times their productivity.
Current demographic trends in all rich countries mean that GDP growth won't come anymore from a growing number of workers. For example, the number of U.S. workers is projected to be stagnant for at least the next 2 decades. And Europe has an even worse problem with its working-age population.
Subreplacement fertility a generation and more ago means that the working-age population, aged 15 to 64, is going to be slowing and then peaking and then declining more or less indefinitely as far as the demographer's eye can see.
So if the working-age population is shrinking, how can we increase human capital?
Well, if you have fewer and fewer workers, each one of them has to get that much more productive in order to even keep the economy from shrinking, right? So in the context of flat or falling population, we have a much greater challenge just to keep the current standard of living what it is. That's not controversial at all. That's just economics 101.
Without more people, productivity increases and economic increases can only come from our working either harder or smarter. Is this a problem?
What we in the West have been doing is putting all of our eggs in the human capital basket and saying we're going to increase the productivity of each person and letting the expansion of population part just go down the tubes and not even pay any attention to it. Well, we've come to the end of the road on that. We can't keep going down that particular path.
The challenge for us is that we are actually achieving the opposite of what we need. Our educational levels are declining, not rising. They were, the highest in the world, and after 1977 or 75, they kind of peaked out. College going has really stabilized at a high level, but ceased its expansion. Among boys, it's actually declined.
If we have a steep drop-off in the best trained people entering into the workforce, other things being equal, we've got a problem.
The problem is this. The baby boomers are the most educated generation we've had in our history, and they're retiring. It used to be we had a good old system. It used to be, it's called early retirement. We would retire the old folks who had maybe 15% college degrees, retire them and replace them by a new generation that had 25% college degrees. And so the overall skill level in the workforce would rise through early retirement. Now we have the most educated generation out there ready to retire, And behind them, it's a less educated generation. So as we retire the seniors now, we lower the quality level in the workforce.
As long as education trends are headed in the wrong direction, just maintaining our current standards of living will require us to begin working harder and harder over time. The only other option is to innovate labor-saving technologies, like the baby boomers did with the computer revolution of the 1980s and 90s. The only problems are that innovations require high levels of education, and our total capacity to innovate is also affected by declining populations.
You have less people who are there to innovate. You know, there's only a limited number of people who have the ideas, the capacity, the brilliance to innovate. And so you have a smaller population, you have a smaller pool to draw on.
The projections for Western Europe are that the group 30 to 44 years of age is going to drop very significantly in size, maybe by 15 or 20%. Why does that in particular matter? Because over the last century, it's people between the ages of 30 and 44 in all developed countries who've disproportionately been the innovators.
No matter how you look at it, falling fertility seems to limit the number of people available to innovate. So unless fertility increases or education levels improve, we are all going to be working progressively harder in the future without getting any richer. But unfortunately, this is not the end of the bad news, because our current standard of living is going to get a lot harder to maintain for reasons other than human capital decline. We saw earlier that as fertility drops to below replacement levels, population structures become inverted. The reason for this is that population structures simply begin to resemble their average families over time, and herein lies a number of problems.
In many countries today, the average family only has one child. And if you think of what that means for the future, it means going forward, very few people will have brothers or sisters, obviously, but neither will they have uncles or aunts or nieces or nephews. And this is a whole world in which, as you grow older, you find yourself literally related to no one. That, to me, portends a very lonely world going forward, and one in which people will have to invent families or pseudo-families of some kind in order to get the extended support that we all need from others. So that's a real challenge to the future of the family, and I think one of the real human and easy to understand consequences of these trends.
Besides socio-familial problems, there are practical economic problems when family size declines. Consider that when families average 3 or more children, the population as a whole has more children than parents, and more parents than grandparents. In other words, there are a lot more young, healthy workers compared to elderly, retired people. But all of this changes if families have, say, one child each. Over time in such a society, there are more grandparents than parents, and more parents than children, which means that this inverted population structure is also an aged population structure. That is, it has proportionately less young than old.
That population should be aged in itself is not bad, in the sense that it's good to have elderly people who can then pass on their values to succeeding generations. What is bad about the aging of population is a huge gap that is left at the base of the population pyramid, which means that there is a huge lack of youth.
It is a positive aspect that the elderly live longer, so that we live longer. But if there is no young population growing as well, the population is aging, and this has, only from the economic point of view, will become into a very big economic crisis.
Because again, we're coming out of a period where it was the golden age for the retirees. Every retiree and many populations had 2 or 3 workers being able to support them, and that's going to change.
By 2050, every region of the world will have a significantly higher percentage of elderly than they do today. Here's what will happen in Germany.
People over 65, we're treating people not in daily working life, will double.
And then this is all bringing about a process of huge tensions within society and within the economy, to the effect that even the social security system could come down.
The real worry now with population decline is that there won't be enough people to produce the goods and services that an aging population really needs in order to thrive or even survive.
My experience in talking to people about this is that they simply don't understand what's about to happen, particularly when it comes to medical care. A lot of people I've talked to about this say, well, isn't it great if the birth rate is going down, because after all, that's fewer carbon footprints and less stress on Mother Earth. Not thinking about how much their own care is going to cost when they get older.
Providing retirement benefits, including health care for the elderly, is becoming unsustainable even in the most wealthy nations of the world. Here's what's happening in the United States.
We are accustomed to financing retirement and health benefits for the elderly by taxes on the working population.
The one thing that people really need to understand about Social Security is that it is a pay-as-you-go program.
Low fertility levels, which is the main cause of declining populations, means we don't have so many people in working ages compared to those who are retired and collecting retirement and other benefits.
And unfortunately, we're going to see some very big and some very unfavorable changes in the ratio of workers to retirees. Today, we have more than 3 workers supporting each retiree, but that's going to decline over time pretty sharply starting around 2030. As a result, we're going to be looking at a ratio closer to 2 workers per retiree.
How are we going to finance it in the future when the stock of the working population is declining relative to the stock of the receiving population?
Right now, the baby boom generation, the vast number of people born from 1946 through 1964, are in the workforce. They're paying into the system, helping fund the benefits that are being provided to the people who are already retired. But over the upcoming years, we're going to see that set of people move into the retirement phase. Social Security is only one part of the problem that we confront on the fiscal front. Medicare and Medicaid are a much bigger problem. Their growth is absolutely staggering under current law.
If these taxes go up because we have fewer people, we have to tax them each more, that's going to be a burden on the younger population, and they will adjust to that burden in a number of ways, partly maybe by investing less in their human capital, partly by maybe working less, and that will have further negative consequences. That's going to be a major challenge, which we're not yet prepared for.
Imagine if all your taxes went for nothing but Social Security and Medicare.
The burden will eventually be unbearable.
You can make people work later ages before they're eligible for Social Security. And given the increasing mental and physical health of the elderly, I think all societies should do that regardless of the problem. Some societies like Japan is already doing it. I think men retire at age 69 on average in Japan, much later than the United States, for example. So that would be one approach. Second approach is you cut benefits. You don't have the money, you cut benefits. I think all societies are going to think about doing that. And the third is you raise the taxes and other burdens on the children of the elderly.
In summary, as populations begin to age, care of the elderly will become increasingly difficult for younger generations. So an already difficult decline in human capital will be compounded for the next shrinking generation of workers. And as long as fertility rates remain below the replacement level, this situation, by definition, becomes worse over time. But there are still other unexpected consequences of fertility decline. As of 2010, the working age population of all rich countries combined has already started to shrink. And taxes tend to be higher in countries where fertility is lower. So what have rich countries started to do about it all?
We're so low in the number of babies being born that we don't have enough workers. And so that induces immigration to move into the country to bring new workers to fill the gaps that are left over by having too few native children being born.
Just since 1990, 60% of U.S. population growth has come from immigrants and their children. What population growth there still is in Europe has been partly from people living longer, but predominantly from immigration.
There is a global growth of the European population, but 80% of this growth is due to immigration.
The result of massive immigration in Germany, as well as in virtually all rich countries, is that immigrant cultures are projected to become the majority by 2050. Consider how the composition of society will change in the United States over time. By 2050, the vast majority of the United States population will be Hispanic. Already half of the city council in Brussels is comprised of recent immigrants or their children. The immigrant population of cities like Rotterdam is 40%, and the most common boy's name in Amsterdam is Mohammed. Europe's native populations are actually disappearing at astonishing rates. The U.S. has a long tradition of successful immigration, and so the transition is expected to go well.
It's what America has done well. We've assimilated. You know, we've had Polish, German, Scottish, all kinds of communities, even Hispanic community that have moved into our country. But ultimately, they become Hispanic American. They become Polish American, German American. They don't remain Polish, they don't remain Hispanic, and ultimately the countries in Europe haven't yet figured out how to do that.
We are all immigrants here. That's very, very different than a place like Germany or France, where there is a German identity. And it's almost impossible for people there to think of somebody from Turkey, let's say, being a German. It's because there is a German, shall we say, a kind of a German blood, and the outsider simply is an outsider. They do not have the kind of immigrant society that we've always had. So they are trying to deal with a very, very new environment.
So what's going to happen is you've got Europe needing these workers. They're going to come in from Muslim countries, from Africa, from Asia, and you're going to end up with a situation of potentially an explosive situation if they're not assimilated into the culture. You'll see certain cultures disappear as well. It's entirely possible that the French, if you use the projections, the French will disappear. There will be no native born Frenchmen that come from the traditional French population.
Think it can't really happen? That a civilization be lost to low fertility?
The Romans in the time of Julius Caesar were totally preoccupied by the fear that they were not producing enough children.
later emperors passed laws obligating young men to get married and have children, they wouldn't do it.
It got to the point where people would pretend to adopt children and pretend to marry. We know this from satirists such as Juvenal, as a way of escaping the taxes.
No one wanted to have any children, and no one wanted to get married.
But again, the result wasn't that Rome depopulated. It was the composition of the population that changed. The sterile pagan nobility died out, and with them their ancestors' idea of Rome. They were replaced by more patriarchal people called Christians.
Projections show that cultures of Western nations may change significantly by 2050. But while some obsess about this as a problem, there's actually a far bigger problem with immigration. Consider that developing countries, the main source of immigration, are themselves experiencing fertility decline.
Mexico has experienced an incredible birth dearth. The decline in fertility in Mexico is without precedent in world history.
Back in 1970, there was typically, on average, there was 6.8 babies per woman. Today, it's down to 2.4, and some say 2.2 babies per woman. Mexico no longer has this surplus of kids being born, and that has lots of repercussions. It means they have less competition for jobs inside Mexico. It also means they have less potential immigrants to send across the border to the U.S. We've been dependent on Mexican workers. We may not get those workers in another decade. Once this smaller young generation comes of age, there won't be the surplus kids that we're used to.
Americans have this vision that there'll always be Mexicans trying to come across the border and that we need some huge wall to keep them out. Well, careful what you wish for, because not only in Mexico, but throughout Latin America, we're seeing these dramatic declines in fertility.
According to the UN, population aging is accelerating in Latin America and the Caribbean. Latin American children have been in decline since 2005, and the working age demographic will peak by 2040. If the US will be in trouble in coming years, Europe will be too. That's because Asia and Africa have been major sources of immigration into Europe. According to the UN, the number of children in Asia have been declining since 2005, and the Asian working age population will peak by 2040, at which time there will be more elderly than children in all of Asia. Even the number of African children will have peaked by 2050, according to the UN. Some are very surprised to learn even Middle Eastern populations, the other major source of European immigration, are experiencing fertility decline. But one final consequence of fertility decline is likely to occur even before immigration problems, and it is certain to strike much closer to home.
Pretty much every homeowner thinks that there's a market out there, and the market is, the market is anonymous. It's not clear who constitutes the market. But if you look at the facts and just do the simple math, there's way too many baby boomers who are going to be older. Do the math, add 10 to their years of age, and you figure out that they'll be crossing age 75 here in another couple of years. Most people think that builders provide housing, or that developers are the source of housing. In reality, that's only about 15% of housing supply. The other 85% comes from existing homeowners who then relinquish their homes. We call them existing homes, or they're used homes for sale. And as the baby boomers have grown older, they moved up the ladder of housing consumption to bigger houses, more expensive houses. And now in their 50s, the boomers are sort of leveling off, and eventually they'll begin to downsize, move to more comfortable, retirement housing or move to a condo. And when that happens, we'll have this glut of homes that they occupied that will then be released onto the housing market. And as that gets released, the generational bubble could collapse.
Some demographers have been predicting a housing collapse for decades. Here's what one demographer said about it 1 year before the economic crash of 2008.
Real estate is going to fall. What we're seeing, this slowing, which we did predict in the second half of this decade, after 2005, this is a slowing in a good economy. Real estate's weak. Why? Baby boomers have already bought their real estate, their homes for their families, and their kids are leaving the nest. Who's going to buy these McMansions? The answer is nobody.
Interestingly enough, relatively few economists today are highly aware of demographic issues. But this one is.
You know, the growth rate of population is one of the most basic parameters of the economy, if you like. It's one of those things that every individual simply has to take as given when they're making their economic decisions. And so the reality is that the baby boomers have bought the biggest house they're ever going to have, and they're now downsizing their homes. There aren't that many people coming along who are going to need the size of home that the baby boomers have, and so it's not surprising, actually, that the housing market is out of kilter because of that big bulge of baby boomers.
And the advantage of taking it demographically is you can predict it far better, because you know the people inside here, you have a sense of where they're going to be in 10 years. If you have an economic model, you don't have any clue what's going to be in 10 years for the economic drivers. I always tell my economist friends, I tweak them gently, that demographers are smarter than economists, because we all know the economic variables are the most important for all kinds of consumer decisions. But how come you economists can't tell me what interest rates are going to be in 3 months? They don't know. Whereas demographers, we can see ahead for 10 years, because we know that in 10 years' time, everybody's going to be 10 years older. Older people tend to sell homes more than they buy them, and who they sell them to is younger people. And we have an imbalanced age structure now. It's top-heavy, so you have more older folks, and those older folks become home sellers, and there's about 60% too many sellers relative to the number of buyers in future decades. And as the aging baby boomers move into this for sale market, this age when they are likely to sell off, they then flood that market of for sale homes. So that's a major implication we hadn't thought about.
Any of us wish we might have had the economic insight of demographics before all of this began to happen?
Adam Smith, probably the greatest of all economists, once wrote that prosperity is associated with growing populations, and depression, he didn't quite use that word, but he meant that, is associated with declining population. It's new, it could lead to very serious other negative consequences. These are a few that I mentioned.
Before Adam Smith became famous for writing The Wealth of Nations, Benjamin Franklin had already said that populations double every 20 years. And ever since then, we have collectively presumed that populations would always grow. Perhaps that is why we never even thought much until recently about economic consequences of population decline. But be that as it may, since the 1968 publication of The Population Bomb, many of us began to worry that population growth was all bad, and by implication, that human depopulation would be all good. And thus, for those of us who have long worried about overpopulation, it may be very difficult to begin worrying about eventual depopulation. And yet the unexpected economic consequences of fertility decline will be a demographic winter, particularly for what children will yet be born. Which raises new questions. Why did fertility fall in the first place? What are the possible solutions? And is there any hope for turning it around?